Ember, a lovely red-headed half-elf with bright green eyes, grew up in a tiny woodland village. Her mother, a human druid named Sorsha, raised her alone, in a tiny one-bedroom cabin, often having to share a bed during the cold winters to avoid freezing to death. Her elvish father, Eris, was never in her life as far as she could remember, and it was painful for Sorsha to talk about him, so Ember never asked why he left. Ember looked remarkably like her mother, aside from her bright red hair, freckles, and emerald green eyes. Those were from Eris. "You got the only good parts of him, and I'm grateful for that," Sorsha would always say to Ember. Ember's mother was kind and helped anyone in need, despite not having much themselves. They were able to afford what little they had by selling potions, medicinal salves, and occasionally deep tissue massages. For Ember's 14th birthday, Sorsha saved her coins for weeks just to take her into the town of Scywood for a special birthday present, a beautiful, delicate little cupcake with shimmering sprinkles and soft chocolate cake. As they were leaving the bakery, distracted and entranced by the delightful confection, they walked themselves into the path of a herd of spooked horses. Sorsha managed to push her daughter out of the way. Ember could do nothing but watch helplessly as her mother was trampled. Ember never left the city after that. She spent the better half of 2 years pickpocketing, fighting, and stealing. On a particularly cold morning, while sheltering under a cafe's patio, she overheard 2 elder half-elf females talking about Bree, the merciful and benevolent queen of Solandria, and her Way of Mercy monastery. The females recounted the stories of the monks from this place who used their keen abilities and skills to not only heal, but to also defend themselves, as well as others. As the females were leaving, Ember crawled out from the patio and approached them, her red hair matted to her scalp, dirty from head to toe, and nearly emaciated from the lack of proper nourishment. Although she looked like death, she bowed slightly and politely asked them more about this Way of Mercy monastery. Taking a pity on Ember, the females brought her to their home, cleaned her up, fed her, and arranged a carriage to take her to the monastery with a letter of recommendation. Ember committed their names to memory, Countess Entworth and her wife, Lady Alexandra, and vowed to repay their kindness. When Ember arrived at the monastery, it wasn't as easy as she thought it would be to join. If it wasn't for the recommendation from the Countess and her wife, they would not have even looked her way, but she did finally get her an audience with the master, Molly. Molly was a satyr, short in stature, but with thick fur covering most of her body. She had an ancient face, but her mane was thick and full, with 2 small horns atop her head. Molly put Ember through a series of tests, right there in the monastery's courtyard. To Ember's surprise, Molly did not test her on her prowess or physical aptitude, but she instead tested her on various moral dilemmas and her moral code. Ember completed the test, but Molly walked away without a word. Ember didn't move. She refused to leave, and it wasn't until the next evening, with Ember still standing there in the courtyard, covered in freshly fallen snow and shivering, that Molly finally welcomed her to train and showed her to her new room. As Ember laid in bed that evening, she thought of her mother, Sorsha, and as she fell into a deep, restful sleep, she dreamed of her mother's eyes beaming with pride. Molly, the master of the monastery, took on Ember as her own student, and ultimately became like a second mother to her. Ember and Piper, Molly's other student, were taught how to read people and the art of becoming shadows and not being seen. Ember was also taught how to use her medicinal skills in combat, and how to take down a threat with the power of a few well-placed hits. Ember excelled with her training, and although Piper was also exceptional, she always seemed to trail behind Ember, always standing in her shadow, and so she quickly became jealous of Molly's affection towards her. After a few years of intense training, the 2 students were ready for their first mission, handed down from Queen Bree herself. Ember and Piper were required to utilize their skills to track down and eliminate the shady presence in the city that was seeding crime, murder, and corruption throughout the kingdom. With such an unusually dangerous mission, Molly was assigned to accompany them. It didn't take long. This seed of corruption was thick and present in every dark corner of the kingdom, and Ember was able to track down the whereabouts of the presumed leader just outside the city, in an area she knew to stay away from. A seedy and dark place, where some unfortunate soul screams could be heard on most nights. Blood runs like a river through this part of town. The three scouted the area for a few days before they discovered an underground hideout, marked by a little cabin in the middle of the woods outside the city. Broken windows, roof falling in. It would be easy to mistake it as abandoned. Ember had learned from her eavesdropping in the shadows that there was a series of tunnels and encampments beneath it. It was almost too easy for them to discover when and where the scouts roamed, and which ones were reliably lazy and unaware of their surroundings, which was most of them. After days of careful planning, the party prepared for their final leg of the mission. Piper insisted that she was not tired and should take the first watch, so Ember and Molly slept. The sun rose slowly over the Adian mountains as Ember and Molly struggled to wake up. They found themselves bleary-eyed and confused. Their minds were foggy and slow, unable to form coherent thoughts. Consciousness hit Ember first as she felt a shadowed figure stand over her. His deep red hair fell to his shoulders, with pointed ears peeking out behind a braid. Ember struggled to focus on his face until he leaned down. It was the emerald green eyes that became clear first. "You look exactly like your mother. Except your eyes. Those are exactly like mine," he said. A wicked grin smeared his narrow face, but that grin never reached his eyes. And although they may have the same eyes, her father's eyes held no love, no spirit, no joy. They were empty, soulless. Ember laid there stunned, unable to move. Her arms had been tied behind her back, and as she struggled to get out of the tangle of rope, she spotted Molly. All Ember could see was Molly listlessly squirming until a blunt end of a handle hit her temple, and her eyes finally rolled up into her head as she fell back unconscious. Ember's father, still leaning over her, looked to the figure standing over Molly and nodded. The figure was now holding the blade of a large battle axe over Molly's neck. It was Piper, she realized. Ember was unable to scream as the axe came down, severing Molly's head from her body. "Oh, little ladybug, my darling daughter." Ember's father kissed two of his fingers and pressed them to her tear-stained cheek. "Take this as a mercy, and don't come looking for us again, or your friend Piper here will be more than happy to reunite you with your master. Sleep well, little ladybug." With his last words, Ember found herself lulled to sleep by his magic. Ember finally awoke from a deep, dreamless sleep after many hours. The rope binding her arms had been cut, but that was where her luck and hope ended as she turned to face Molly's ruined body. She laid there for half the day, staring back into Molly's lifeless eyes, and as the sun fell behind the Adian mountain peaks, Ember's hopelessness turned to resolve. She sat there, eyes never leaving Molly's. She leaned over and picked up the satyr's head and gently closed its eyes. Today, you can find Ember wearing the skull of her former master during battle. Inside the skull are two names carefully carved into it. A promise of death. Eris and Piper.